B'siyata d'shmaya, we're now going to continue part 2 of this specific idea, which is of course right in the sugya of business and halacha, but specifically discussing the shaila of using business supplies in the office, warehouse and such for a personal usage. Is a person allowed to do that? Very, very common shailas. And the truth of the matter is, I don't even know how much of a maskana we're going to come out with, simply because there are such a diversity of different ideas and different practices according to different industries that it's going to be difficult. But we'll try the best that we can to give some of the gedorim that we find in Chazal and of course in Shulchan Aruch to see where we're coming from. So just a little bit of a disclaimer before we continue where we were holding on last time. We spoke last time about how chomer it is to steal and how careful a person has to be even from taking something that's even a shava pruta. It's a small amount, but it's worth something and has a halachic worth. Memela, that is going to be over on an issue of stealing, and a person has to be careful. That is what we spoke about yesterday, last time. And we also mentioned a couple of different ideas from the Mishnah of where everything can come from, that we go by the industry norms, which we'll get to. Just a couple of disclaimers, by the way. Rav Elyashiv Zatzal paskened very, very clearly that, for example, if a person steals something that belongs to many partners, so there's a little bit of a misconception that people have, is that if I steal something that belongs to many of the partners, what's the din in that case? Happens to be today's daf yomi, but it's a different sugya. But I'll upon him, what happens if a person steals something that belongs to many, many partners, which means when I return it, or if I would return it, the chi of hashava would be less than a shava pruta for each and every partner. What din does that have? So Lamais Rav Elyashiv Zatzal paskind that you are over on stealing even if it's owned, the company, the factory, the warehouse, the business, whatever it is owned by a bunch of partners, and if I split up the worth of the item that I stole, one paper clip, one staple, one pen, it's less than a shava pruta for each and every partner. Memela, it's less than a shava pruta, right? Because they're all owning it. Rav Elyashiv paskind, that is of course considered to be stealing. Not only that, Rav Elyashiv went on to paskin that according to most, and Rav Elyashiv paskin this way also, that if you have, for example, a private corporation or an LLC, now legally it's considered to be a distinct entity. However, that's only legally. Halachically, it is considered to be the property of the individuals that own it, and therefore, yes, you are over on gneva or gzela when you steal something that belongs to a private company in that case. So too, if a person steals from a publicly traded company, if there's a company that's publicly selling shares or anything similar to that, don't think that, it's a publicly owned company and therefore I'm not really stealing from anyone. By the way, that could have huge ramifications for Hilchos Tfilas Kelim. That's a really different shaila. But according to the get the gabi stealing, that is considered to be stealing. And of course, even if a person is stealing from a government entity, whether it's the US federal, state or local government body, at the end of the day, that is considered to be stealing. So just a little bit of a disclaimer before we move on, that all of these are under the umbrella of stealing, and a person has to be careful. Now here's halacha l'maisa. What can I l'maisa use? How does it work? What can I take? What can I not take? And what does Chazal say about such a thing? So the Gemara in Bava Metzia Daf Kuf Yud Tes Amud Beis tells us as follows. The Gemara in Bava Metzia Kuf Yud Tes Amud Beis mentions two specific things that we started last year with this Inyan as well. And that is number one, the Gemara says it depends on the boss's wishes. That means it depends on what the boss wants and allows. And number two, the norms of that business. It very much depends on what the normality is from that specific business, from that industry which we spoke about. So the Gemara tells us there are two mahalchim that a person can use. One of the examples the Gemara brings is a tailor, someone that's busy making suits and various things, and he's sewing a garment. The Gemara says what happens after finishing sewing the garment is the tailor allowed to take the scraps of fabric, of material, and use it for his own personal usage. Is he allowed to keep it? So the Gemara says that if the customer who gave you the material is makpid and he wants it back, then obviously they belong to him, and obviously you can't use it in that case. If he does not care about the scraps and he says keep them, I don't want them, then of course the tailor has permission to keep them in that case. Now the Gemara brings us different examples. The Gemara, for example, brings an example of a stone cutter or of a gardener. All of these halachas the Gemara brings us tells us it depends if he's makpid or he's not makpid. So therefore it would seem to say that if the boss that you're working for is makpid on every staple, paperclip, file, pen, paper, whatever it may be, then of course you can't take it. That's number one. Then the Gemara goes on and brings another standard. And that's not necessarily, says the Gemara, based on the boss that you're working for, but rather the Gemara says it depends on local custom. It all depends on the industry standards for that specific industry, not necessarily what the boss wants or cares about. Now, by the way, the nafkamina, of course, between these two mahalchim in the Gemara is if the boss is more machmeh than industry standard. If the boss is more machmeh, for example, if the standard practice, for example, I mentioned to you last time that somebody I spoke to worked in a restaurant and a pizza store in New York. So he says to me that his boss allows him to take, a certain amount for himself. But he can't obviously bring food home to his whole mishpacha to have dinner that night. That he won't allow. So what is the din if, for example, the boss is more machmeh than the regular standard? Now, it's standard practice if you're working in a pizza store or something similar, that if you want to eat lunch, you can eat lunch. I don't think any pizza store does not allow their workers to eat lunch. Maybe they don't allow them to continue eating the whole day. But it for sure would be normal for a person who's working in a pizza store, take a couple of slices and eat lunch. That's fine. What if the boss is more machmeh than regular practices, standard industry practices? What would be in that case? Are we going to say that we go boss to the boss, because that's one mahalach of the Gemara, or are we going to say we go boss to the regular standard industry practice, which is the other mahalach of the Gemara? So we have two mahalachim in the Gemara. What do we do halacha l'maisa? So the Rambam in Hilchos Geneva Perek Vav halacha ches paskins like the second mahalach in the Gemara, that is local custom wins. Whatever the local custom is, that's how the Rambam halacha l'maisa paskins. It's also moved in Shulchan Aruch in Chosh Mishpat Semen Shin Nun Ches Sif Yud Aleph. That we go with the second mahalach, and that depends on what the local custom. That means if the local custom of that business, of that industry, is you're allowed to take things for personal usage, you're allowed to print a couple of papers of the parasha sheet that you want to print before Shabbos Kodesh to take home with office supplied paper and all those things, the Rambam would be etzem paskin that would be mutter if it is the normal industry accepted practice. The Ramah, however, is chaylik. Comes along the Ramah, Chosh Mishpat, Siman Shin Nun Ches, Sif Yud Aleph, and the Ramah paskin is like the first mahalach of the Gemara, which means we don't go by the normal standard practice, but we go by the boss. So it depends. Whatever the boss wants, if the boss allows it, then great. If the boss doesn't allow it, then avad it's not good. And this is interesting because there's a tshuva in Rav Vosner's Sefer Shevet HaLevi. In Shevet HaLevi, Chelet Dalet Siman Reish Chof, he brings over there about a kasha that somebody asked him about a factory worker that was working in a specific factory, and there were items over there, and he writes, that were constantly replaced by the boss. So these are items that if you look at them, you're like, well, the boss always replaces them, so therefore I could take them home, because he doesn't care about them, why should I? He replaces them, so therefore it doesn't make a difference to him if I take them. So Rav Vosner brings down the shaila, and he says, is a person allowed to take something that the boss always replaces, and therefore could be that he's not so makbid on it? And Rav Vosner paskins obviously like the Ramah, which means it really depends on what the boss says. If he's a makbid, problem. If he's not makbid, then obviously it will be okay. So obviously it will be very, very difficult for us to, explain each and every single industry and every situation. But let me give you some examples of perhaps just some little guidelines that you can have in this situation. And the best things to do, by the way, when you start a business, when you start a work, whether you're the boss or whether you're the worker working under the boss, whether you're an employer or the employee, whatever it may be, make a stipulation, make a condition. If you're hiring workers, tell them what they can and cannot take, right? You're the boss, you could do that, the Ramah. However, if you're working for someone else, ask the boss when you get the job, is it okay if I take a pen in my pocket? I might need it for work purposes during the day, but I have it and I might take it home. Or can I print a couple of papers for the parasha sheet, which I want to print because I don't have a printer at home, or I'm out of paper and I want to file. Make a stipulation very clear, which makes it much easier. Now, if you don't have a stipulation, then as we mentioned, the halacha basically recognizes two ways, either the boss or either the standard industry, which could be very simple. If you know the industry and you know where you're working and you know what the normal accepted practice is, then you could definitely go with that. If the employer is more generous than the standard practice, then you can go with your boss, even if it's more makel, it's more lenient than general standard practice. But if there's no agreement and you don't know the standard practice, then I would suggest that you do not take anything for personal usage unless you, again, have the explicit permission from the boss, or you know that the boss allows it, or you know that standard practice is to allow it in that case. And we have to remember that, of course, stealing is a very chomer aveira. The Medrash tells us in Shemois Chav Beis Ois Gimel how careful a person has to be from stealing. It blocks a person's tefillas. A person will daven with all of his heart, and he'll wonder, why is the Rabbeinu Shalom not listen? It's because he's stealing. It's because he's doing things that he shouldn't. He has things in his possession that do not belong to him. It's very, very important to be careful to do that. And as we said last time, from the Heilige B'nai Yisachar and the others as well, that the idea is that a person has to realize that his emunah is in Hashem, and he realizes whatever I have is what Hashem wants me to have. Whatever I don't have is what Hashem does not want me to have. If Hashem wanted to give me more, He would give me more. He has the capabilities, and I trust Him that He would do it if it's the right thing. And Be'ez Hashem, the Rabbeinu Shalom, after learning these halachos, should give us the siyata d'shmaya to keep them. Be'ez Hashem, tomorrow, Rabbi Sai, brand new halacha. Join us.